بفضلك من نفادي
يا سميعا يا مجيبا يا عظيما
اهدني يا خالق السبع الشهاد
أشرقت نفسي بنور من فؤادي حينما رددت يا رب العباد وانتشت روحي وصار الدمع.
Sorry for the delay. Just come in so they don't miss out in the beginning. First of all, Jazakallah khair, all of you, thank you so much for coming and a warm welcome to all of you. It is so lovely to meet all of you in person and it is so nice that we're all here to support and hear from our brother Mohamed Hassan. Before we begin, I would like to invite Brother Adil Chada to start with the tilawat.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. To start the session, I will recite Surah Fatiha. أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الحمد لله رب العالمين الرحمن الرحيم مالك يوم الدين إياك نعبد وإياك نستعين اهدنا الصراط المستقيم صراط الذين أنعمت عليهم غير المغضوب عليهم ولا الضالين. After a discussion with Brother Mohamed Hassan, we decided that the most apt ayahs to read for this occasion would be in Surah Al-Imran from ayah 102 to 105. Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. يا أيها الذين آمنوا اتقوا الله حق تقاته ولا تموتن إلا وأنتم مسلمون. Who believe, fear Allah as He should be feared, and die not except in a state of Islam. واعتصموا بحبل الله جميعا ولا تفرقوا واذكروا نعمة الله عليكم إذ كنتم أعداء فألف بين قلوبكم فأصبحتم بنعمته إخوانا وكنتم على شفا حفرة من النار فأنقذكم منها كذلك يبين الله لكم آياته لعلكم تهتدون. And hold fast altogether by the rope which Allah stretches out for you, and be not divided among yourselves. And remember with gratitude Allah's favor on you, for ye were enemies and He joined your hearts in love, so that by His grace you became brothers. And you were on the brink of the pit of fire, and He saved you from it. Thus doth Allah make His signs clear to you, that ye may be guided. وَلْتَكُنْ مِنْكُمْ أُمَّةٌ يَدْعُونَ إِلَى الْخَيْرِ وَيَأْمُرُونَ بِالْمَعْرُوفِ وَيَنْهَوْنَ عَنِ الْمُنْكَرِ وَأُولَئِكَ هُمُ الْمُفْلِحُونَ. Let there arise of you a band of people, inviting to all that is good, enjoining what is right, and forbidding what is wrong. They are the ones to attain felicity. ولا تكونوا كالذين تفرقوا واختلفوا من بعد ما جاءهم البينات وأولئك لهم عذاب عظيم. Be not like those who are divided amongst themselves and fall into disputes after receiving clear signs. For them is a dreadful penalty. Sadaqallahu al-Azim.
Jazakallah khair, Brother Adil. And once again, a very warm welcome to all of you from New Zealand Muslim Association. And before we go forward, I'd like to introduce Brother Mohamed Hassan a bit more formally. So he's an award-winning poet, journalist, podcaster, and producer. He's the author of National Anthem, as well as his recent book, How to Be a Bad Muslim, and you can see copies of the book here. And his poems have been widely shared online and are taught in hundreds of schools internationally. He has stored his work across New Zealand, Australia, the US, and UK, at TEDx and at the Cheltenham Literature Festival, and he represented New Zealand at the Individual World Poetry Slam in 2016. And he has also been covering, as a journalist, he has been covering the Israeli-Palestine conflict and talking about Islamophobia, racism, and things like that. So we are really honored to have him here and really happy that he has accepted our invitation to be here today. I'd like to invite Brother Mohamed Hassan and Sister Zainab Mustafa on stage, who will be having the conversation here for us. She is a NIA executive.
Assalamu alaikum, guys. Jazakallah khair for joining us this evening, for being here. So just before I get into the book, like Sister Nila said, you're a poet, you're a podcaster, and anyone who's known, if you had the chance to read his book, I would argue it's quite poetic, even though it's just, it is a book, and quite eloquently written. And so, in saying that, what would you say inspired you to write the book?
Jazakallah khair, and thank you to NZM for hosting us today. It's a real pleasure also to be here in the Fickling Center, because I feel like this is like a Muslim institution.
100%.
I've attended so many weddings here, so it feels good to be back.
Yeah, in the area.
I wanted to, when I started writing this book, and as you mentioned, I do come from a poetry background, and for the vast majority of my writing has been in poetry, outside of my work as a journalist. And at some point, I decided to write something a little more long form and a little more.
Should I use my mic instead?
Okay, it's back. It's back. So I wanted to write something that. Okay, cool. Everybody with me? Awesome. The journey of this book began with a couple of essays that I was writing, that I'd been asked to write about the Muslim experience. So the first one was an essay about my experience in airports as a Muslim, which ended up being in the book. And I chronicled what it was like being a Muslim and being a journalist traveling around the world and going to a lot of places and getting stopped at almost every airport, including here in New Zealand. And this was something that I had spent a long time covering as a journalist when I was working for our RNZ at the time, interviewing other Muslims and their experiences with airports. And so I decided to collect my own experiences and then use it to talk about what it is like and what it has been like being a Muslim. And I think at the bottom of it, and what I really wanted to communicate through the book, is that there is a specific and unique experience that we Muslims have been under or have endured for the last 20 years that oftentimes feels quite invisible to the rest of the world. People have their interactions with Muslims, people see the kinds of coverage that is of the Muslim community and of Islam in the news and the media, but very few people really understand what it has been like to be a Muslim. And in terms of the daily experience, in terms of all of the things that suddenly become a lot more complicated and a lot more political, not through any actions of our own, but just through who we are and how we exist. And so I wanted to write this from a personal lens, to talk about my own experiences, but also to combine it with some of the work that I have been doing in the Muslim community, interviewing other people. And then, over the last couple of years, that had been quite consequential for us in New Zealand, specifically as Muslims. And so that was the intention behind this book.
Hello? Okay, perfect. Well then, I guess my next question would be, how to be a bad Muslim is controversial. It's a controversial book title. Why and how did you decide on it?
So the title of the book is How to Be a Bad Muslim, and it is a controversial title, and it is kind of tongue-in-cheek, and I specifically wanted it to be controversial, and I wanted people to feel a little bit uncomfortable reading it, and the idea behind it was me trying to explain this kind of experience of what it has been like being a Muslim, and specifically the idea that you grow up in a community of Muslims and you're taught all of these things about what it means to be a Muslim. You're taught about prayer, you're taught about fasting, you're taught about modesty, you're taught about carrying your Islam everywhere with you. And then you step outside of the Muslim community and all of these things that you think describe what it means to be a good person are flipped on their heads and are often used against you. And there's been so many times where the idea of being a quote-unquote bad Muslim in the media, in politics, in the way that we talk about the Muslim community under the war on terror since the September 11 attacks, has been flipped upside down. And so in the narrative, a good Muslim suddenly became somebody that isn't actually really that connected to Islam or connected to the community. It's somebody that might be a cultural Muslim or somebody that identifies as a Muslim, but isn't really going to make people uncomfortable with the way that they dress or the way that they behave or their facial hair or any of these things. And that in fact, all of these things, all of the things that we were taught about what it meant to be a Muslim, all the things that we're taught to practice and possess in our lives, made us bad Muslims. So there was a friend of mine called Khalid who grew up in Kuwait, spent all of his life in Kuwait, never really set foot outside of it, and then at some point moved to the UK. And while he was entering at Heathrow Airport, the passport person control asked him, "Are you a good Muslim or a bad Muslim?" And he was so confused because he'd never ever encountered at any point in his life the idea of being a good Muslim versus a bad Muslim. In Islam, there isn't really an outline or a framework for when you are a good Muslim or a bad Muslim. You can be a good person, you can be a bad person, but you can only be Muslim. And this framework around good Muslim versus bad Muslim was this political narrative that suddenly became very real and very present in our lives and the way that we navigated through our societies, and we had very little control over it. And so the title, How to Be a Bad Muslim, and it's the title of one of the main essays in the collection, is about that idea of, okay, if we're going to confront this narrative, we are also, as Muslims, going to have to live with the fact that if we're going to be Muslim, if we're going to be proud of our Islam, of our Muslimness, of our identity, then we are going to be bad Muslims. And that is what this narrative asks of us, and we either try and fit into this impossible box of what it means to be a quote-unquote good Muslim, or we can just be proud of ourselves and be unapologetic, even if it means being quote-unquote bad Muslims.
It's working. So you talked about, that chapter, How to Be a Bad Muslim. Pretty sure it's chapter 11, pretty sure it is. I'm pretty sure it is. And you were working, I'm pretty sure, in media at the time, and journalism. And around that time, there was that hostage situation that happened in Sydney. And for those who don't know, there was a quote unquote like a terrorist hostage that happened at the Lind Cafe in Sydney. You know, reading over that, I was in high school at the time, and I had gone to that cafe just a week before the situation had happened. And to see it on news was crazy, and the way that you had described the situation as well was crazy because you too had been to that cafe. I mean, I'm thinking that could be possibly maybe the worst feelings or moments as a Muslim to be in that space. Would you say that was for you, or maybe perhaps something was worse, or maybe perhaps on the same level? Does that make sense?
Yeah. So I don't know if you guys would remember this this incident that happened, and it was labeled the Sydney Siege, and there was a man that ended up holding a cafe hostage in downtown Sydney, and it was a very iconic cafe, and it made the news everywhere, and it certainly, my nephews have just walked in. Hi Zane. And it was something that was, because of our proximity to New Zealand, was massive news, and so every news outlet was broadcasting live all day long about what was happening, talking to people on the ground. And I was working in TVNZ at the time, and I was working in the newsroom, and I've been working there for about 2 years. And when it happened, obviously, you know, as a Muslim, you go through all of the same kind of feelings when you feel a sense of dread and you feel a sense of uncertainty about you don't know what kind of reaction people are going to have to it. You don't know whether it's going to change your experiences that day or not. But also as a journalist, there was something in me that felt kind of like excited because this is a huge breaking news story, and I was working that day and I was going to be in the newsroom, and I felt like I wanted to be in the newsroom to feel like I was connected to it, but also to feel like I was, you know, doing my job as a journalist. And what I outlined in that essay about that day was that I set foot into the newsroom with all of these people that I've been working with for about 2 years. They knew who I was, they understood basically who I am as a person. And I felt very, very cold in that space. I felt a very different reception. People were almost treating me with a sense of fear and shock about the fact that I was even in this space with them. And there wasn't anything that was articulated, nobody said anything to me, but I felt it. I felt the way all of these colleagues of mine looked at me and then looked on the screen and saw this man who was Muslim in this cafe holding these people hostage, and they connected those two things. And it was almost as if they didn't expect another Muslim to be in this space and almost disrupt this safe environment that they had. And that was a very difficult experience for me to have to articulate and to understand. And it took me a very long time to even tell anybody else about it, because, you know, oftentimes we have those moments of microaggressions or prejudice and we don't know how to deal with them. Sometimes it's very hard to even say whether something was racist or not. It's very hard to articulate it and to make sense of it. But it stayed with me for a very long time, and one of the things that I got from it, or understood from it, was that it wasn't enough to be a good person or a safe person or somebody that speaks eloquently or articulate or all this kind of stuff, that wasn't going to dispel the paranoia and the ignorance that people had, and that there was always going to be this level, this layer of suspicion that kind of followed us around because we never confronted it head on as a society. And unfortunately, what we saw happen in 2019 in Christchurch was the culmination of that. We saw what happened when those sentiments and those conversations that were simmering under the surface for a long time, that nobody was actually confronting in a real way, that we as a Muslim community felt for a long time, that had drastic consequences. And I think I was trying to use that as an example to talk about how that shifted my thinking around what it meant to be a Muslim and around what it meant to try and negotiate your Muslimness in a Western context, in a society, and that to some extent it was kind of a trap, that we shouldn't be stripping parts of ourselves away in order to gain acceptance in a society that isn't necessarily going to give you that acceptance. That acceptance has to come from yourself, within the confidence that you have in who you are.
So I guess adding on to the question, were you able to make peace, I guess, in that workspace? And how did you do that? Because I'm sure that there are many young Muslims who, are working with people that are predominantly non-Muslim or a non-Muslim space. So should they be in a similar situation, I guess what kind of advice could they take from you trying to make peace, I guess, in that space?
Yeah, so I mean, after that experience, and what by far wasn't indicative or representative of everybody that I met in that space. There were people that I met there that really went out of their way to make me feel confident and supported, and that really helped me out. And then I had other experiences. When I was already in New Zealand, I had a really solid, very foundational experience, and I was being mentored by some amazing journalists that really helped me and understood the kind of stories that I wanted to make and gave me space to do that. And so there is different experiences in different spaces that I've definitely had, but it is, there's a lot of industries, and media is definitely one of them, that are not anywhere near as diverse as they need to be. And for anybody working in that space, it is going to be difficult to try and feel like you are understood and accepted. And there was a conversation that I had with a Maori colleague of mine who was kind of a mentor to me, because she was much more senior. She was a very well-established journalist, somebody that had carved a path for herself for a long time. And I spoke to her one day about my fears and concerns around being pigeonholed as a Muslim journalist and only ever being seen as that. And she told me something that kind of made me think about it in a completely different way. She said, listen, people aren't gonna see you as anything but a Muslim journalist. That is kind of the reality that you have to face in this industry. And so you can run away from it and try and shed that label, and you're not going to be able to, or you can embrace it. And you can think about what that actually means and how that affects the way that you do your work. And so that really stuck with me, and that really helped me also understand the fact that I wasn't in this position by chance, or I wasn't in this position to just end up being another journalist who covers stories that anybody else could cover. That I had a responsibility in that role, and that I needed to recognize that and try and work towards doing work that would benefit my community, but also change some of the things and challenge some of the things that I thought were wrong about the way the media portrays Muslims and the Muslim community.
All right. So being a Muslim Kiwi growing up in New Zealand, for those who don't know, what made you choose journalism, poetry, and book writing? Tell us a little bit about your journey.
It was a bit of a journey, I have to be honest. When I was in high school, it was really clear, I think everybody but me, that I loved writing. And I loved telling stories, and I was also obsessed with the media and obsessed with politics, and like a lot of young people that I know are. And it was a lot of English teachers that really encouraged me to keep writing and to keep expressing myself. But I didn't think about that a lot when I was thinking about how to get into university and wanting to do something that was more stable and appropriate. And so I ended up going and doing an engineering degree, which was not me at all. And it was a challenge to get through that. But it was also formative for me, because I think it really, it forced me to really think about what I wanted to do. How it was, what made me feel really passionate and alive. And for me, that was storytelling, and that was writing. And around the same time, I started finding spaces that I could perform poetry at, and I was writing a lot of poetry at the time. And as soon as I entered those spaces, I found my voice, and I found this confidence and this sense of purpose that felt real to me, that felt really connected to me in a way that I hadn't felt when I was in engineering school. And I remember in engineering school that I would just have conversations with a lot of people all the time, and with my family, with my friends, and with my colleagues about, I don't like this, like this isn't making sense to me. And I didn't know what to do. And then one of the things that happened around that time was the Arab Spring, the protests that were happening in Egypt and in Tunisia and Syria at the time, and Yemen, and all of these places. And I was glued to it. It became an obsession for me. I was watching Al Jazeera day and night without sleeping for just wanting to consume every single piece of information that was coming out. And during that time, the reporters that were reporting from Tahrir Square became like heroes to me. And by a couple of months later, I really solidified this idea that I wanted to be a journalist, and I wanted to get into media, and I wanted to use that opportunity to tell people's stories, and to tell stories that I didn't see being told anywhere else. And as a Muslim, we all grow up with this mistrust of the media, and this kind of antagonistic relationship because of the way a lot of mainstream media outlets have treated the Muslim community, have treated Muslim stories, and the way that they've sensationalized terrorism and Al-Qaeda and ISIS and all of this kind of stuff, to the point where for a while it was the only thing people saw when they saw us. And when I entered the media landscape, I realized very early on that the reason this was happening was because we didn't have Muslim journalists. That really was the reason why it was happening. It wasn't necessarily an evil agenda that people had that were trying to do this on purpose. That the journalists that were working in these spaces had the same ignorance about Muslims, that the people were reading their stories or watching them on TV, and that the only way it was going to change was to have people present in those spaces. And I think this is true not just for journalism or media, but it's for all aspects of our society, all sectors of society. We're never going to have representation in the kind of politics that we want or need as a community if we don't have Muslim politicians. We're never going to have the right kind of legal representation if we don't have people working in the legal sector, working in law. We have, mashallah, if any of us get sick at any point in time, every single person knows a Muslim doctor that they can go to. And wouldn't it be wonderful if that was also the case for the media, for law, for any other aspect of our society that affects us, but that we really lack representation in?
No, I think what you're saying reminds me of what Mohamed Hassan said. I'm sure you're familiar, and everyone here is familiar with Mohamed Hassan. But that's exactly what he said in one of his infamous Oxford debate that he had that went viral on YouTube. He did mention that. And so, just going back to the book, sometimes, when we create pieces, and then when we publish them, I think there might be parts of us that regret that there should have been something included in the final script, or maybe something that is in there that you're like, oh damn it, I shouldn't have said that, or whatever the case is. So I'm just curious, have you ever found yourself in either or situation?
I would probably say no, but I think it's more of the way that I think about writing, think about publishing stuff. First of all, there's a lot of stuff that I write that is just not good. It's not good writing, and the editing process of writing anything, whether it's poetry, whether it's a book, is so crucial because it really kind of like filters out all the stuff that's unnecessary, all the stuff that gets repeated, all the stuff that isn't as strong as it can be, or isn't as well thought out as it can be. And so that is, I really believe, and this is like, even in my position, editing other people's work, that's always a thing that I try and reinforce, is that when you edit something, it is always going to be stronger. Like the more stuff you take out, the stronger it will be, because it's boiling down to the core of what you're actually trying to say. The other aspect of it is that I think there was a lot of stuff in that book that made me nervous, and I mean the TVNZ story is definitely one of those things. There's a couple of other moments in there that I wrote about stuff that I felt really strongly about, and then when it came to publishing them, I was nervous because I felt like I was really putting myself out there, and I didn't know how people were going to react to it. But at the same time, to me, that is kind of a reason to do something. If you're feeling nervous about something, if you really believe it. If you don't believe it and it makes you feel nervous, then maybe you should kind of second guess yourself and think about what you actually are trying to say. But if what you are trying to say is truth to you and you feel strongly about, then the fact that it makes you nervous is kind of an indication that it's important. And I hope that was my intention with some of the things that I'm trying to communicate in the book. That the fact that that made me nervous meant that it's something that was true to me and that I wanted to be out there in the world. And the way people interact with it is going to be out of my control.
So on the topic of second guessing, while I was reading the book, you had talked about, being a young person in the West growing up, and there is a specific part where you do talk about alcohol. And the reality is that Muslim youth in the West, it's something that they're experiencing. It's something that they find themselves in, whether it's their friend group or maybe they see it from a distance, but it's there. And I think often at times we try to shut down that conversation, and we don't want to talk about problem solving or how do we move through it, or if we're thrown into a situation, how to deal with it. So I felt that you were quite direct and honest with your experiences. I think a lot of people and Muslims who went through what you went through, especially growing up in that space, they wouldn't have been so honest. So was there any point that you second guessed yourself? You were like, should I say that? Should I not say that? Because it's about alcohol, it's controversial, it's Muslim. And maybe thought about any backlash that you might get? Yeah.
Yes. Yes. That was also one of the pieces that I felt really nervous about. And it wasn't necessarily from the Muslim side, it was from the other side. We all grew up in a country where alcohol is deeply embedded in the culture. It is everywhere, and we all know it, we can all see it. And it's often something that it's very hard to talk about. You see drink driving ads, you see ads talking about responsible drinking, but you also see a whole bunch of advertisements for Heineken and TUI and all these kinds of things everywhere around us. And it's also impossible to separate from the way New Zealand culture is practiced. And it starts when you're in high school and your friends start drinking and other people around you start entering into that space. But it doesn't stop there, it continues. Once you leave high school, once you become an adult, once you go into the workplace, it's still very much present. You have Friday night drinks, you have functions, you have Christmas parties, you have all of these things that all revolve, all of these relationships that are built around alcohol. And there were times when I was working as a journalist that I felt like I was being disadvantaged by the fact that I couldn't go to a bar with some of my colleagues or with my editors or with my managers and have a drink with them and bond. And I was seeing the way that those relationships were being built around me in the office and how almost sacred that bond is in New Zealand culture. And it's hard as somebody that comes from a Muslim background that has to kind of negotiate and make those decisions all the time to kind of figure out how you exist in those spaces and how you avoid certain spaces and how you make decisions about, okay, I'm not going to go to the Christmas party, even though I know that there's a manager there that I want to make a connection with, and then I'm going to lose out on that, but I'm choosing to do this, and this is kind of part of what it means to be a Muslim. And at the same time, if I'm honest with myself, and I tried to be honest in that piece, I was nervous about the reaction of some people in my life that I knew that were Muslims that do drink. And because I don't want to be somebody that is trying, and I was very conscious of the idea that I didn't want to be preaching to people. I didn't want to be telling people, this is the right thing, this is wrong, this is halal, this is haram. Because I didn't want to fold myself into a trap of, because that could then be turned around on me very easily. And I would much rather talk about my own experiences and the reasons that I have decided not to drink, but also root that very specifically in Islam, because that is the reason why I don't drink. And oftentimes I think there's an expectation or a pressure to either to drink, obviously, or if you don't drink, to be, oh, I don't like alcohol, or like I'm make excuses for it. When in reality, if the reason is you don't drink because you're Muslim, and these are the specific reasons, then we should be allowed and we should be comfortable to be able to say that. And I do feel, having said that, I feel like parts of the culture in New Zealand are changing. There's a lot more young people that I'm meeting now that have chosen not to drink for whatever reason. And there are spaces now, there are a lot more people that are having spaces where they choose to avoid alcohol, choose not to have alcohol as a presence. And I talk in there about how important poetry was for me in that space, because I met other people and realized that I had the ability to create spaces that felt safe for people to enter. And it wasn't just Muslims, it was a whole bunch of other people that also felt safer in these places when you removed alcohol out of the situation. So it's something that I think we are increasingly talking about in New Zealand, and I think that's a healthy thing. And I think the more that we talk about it, the healthier conversations we can have around what essentially is a drug that is embedded in our society. And as Muslims, I think we should be comfortable and confident in talking about that as well.
So moving on, clearly you experienced racism, moments of it, or all of it, Islamophobia as well in New Zealand. And how would you say you have coped with it? Perhaps there are maybe some tips or something specific to you that you felt that helped you push through some of the difficult moments.
Yeah, that's a tough question. I don't know if I necessarily have the best answer for it. I definitely have experienced racism and Islamophobia a lot in my life. Some of those moments were firsthand, some of it was secondhand through friends and through family, and some of it was thirdhand through the community and things that were happening around me, things that I was reporting on or stories that I was hearing or observing. And I have been thinking a lot about recently about the fact that there is a kind of privilege that I have to acknowledge of myself, because to some extent, there's a lot of spaces that I can walk in and people won't know that I'm Muslim until I say my name, for example, and then it's obvious. But that really, the worst cases of Islamophobia, the worst cases of anti-Muslim hatred are experienced by Muslim women, first and foremost, and a lot of people that look visibly Muslim. If you have a big beard, if you choose to dress in traditional clothing, a lot of these things will increase the likelihood that you have of getting those negative experiences. And so it's important for me to also acknowledge the fact that there's a lot of things that I haven't experienced, because it's been easier for me to navigate through certain spaces than other people. But beyond that, I mean, it's not easy, and it kind of never does get easier. But I have been also really privileged to be able to have spaces that allowed me to be able to express myself. Poetry was one of the first spaces that allowed me to do that, to talk about my experience and talk about, sometimes through anger and through frustration, and to have a space, a healthy space, a creative space for me to talk about that. And then in journalism was also an outlet for me to be able to highlight the experiences of other people in the community. But it's also something that persists, it continues. And a lot of us experience it, a lot of us see it happening. And there's an aspect of it around the rest of the society. And I think since March 15, there has been a recognition, there has been a change in the way some people behave and the way that some people see the world and see Muslims and Islam. But there's also other aspects of the community, the society that we exist in, that haven't changed. And so, when people ask me about how do you confront racism, generally speaking, regardless of whether it's against us or it's against other people, there's an aspect of it where it's not really up to the person that experiences it to challenge it. It's around other people, their responsibility to challenge it. And I think the very same thing that for us as Muslims, because we endure these Islamophobia and racism and understand it, it also inherently gives us a responsibility to challenge the racism and discrimination that we see around us that isn't targeted against us, but is targeted against other people, other groups, especially if those groups are vulnerable. And if we think about what our role is in society, what our responsibility is, then hopefully that creates an environment where other people feel the same way about us. And this is the kind of environment that I want to grow up in, that I want to live in. And this is the kind of New Zealand that I want to grow up in, where we're all taking care of each other.
Okay. So final question. So what message do you have for young Muslims in schools and in universities?
I think it's pretty inspiring to see so many young people today walking around with a lot of confidence and really affirming their identities and who they are. And I would say that from the last 20 years, we are kind of beginning to enter into a moment where there are opportunities for us in a lot of different areas. It's definitely true in the media, it's true in the art sector, it's true in politics. There is an understanding or an acknowledgement now that there does need to be representation in every aspect of society. And I think it's on us as Muslims, as New Zealanders, to think about how we see ourselves in our communities, to think about what our strengths are, what our passions are, and how we can use them and utilize them in the best way possible. How do we find the kinds of roles in the community and wider society where we can contribute with our strengths? And also, how do we build a community and a society that is able to really rely on itself and rely on the talents and strengths that it has? So I really want to see over the next generation, I want to see young Muslim politicians, I want to see people working in public policy, I want to see people working in the media, I want to see people in front of screen, behind screen, and I want to see people really engaging with what it means to be citizens in a society. I think to a large extent, we're so grateful for our parents' generation, and most of us, in New Zealand are either first or second generation immigrants. We're so grateful for our parents' generation who came here and survived and allowed us to have these dignified lives. And now we have to think about what our responsibility is going forward for this next generation. How do we pick that mantle up and really continue to grow and strengthen our connections to both the country and to each other? How do we build a community where the next generation, people as young as my nephews, when they grow up, they have this really full and alive Muslim community that encourages them to be who they are and to be confident, and so that they carry that into their schools, into their jobs, into their lives, and into society as a whole.
I guess some final comments. What you're saying, your hopes and dreams and what you want for a lot of the Muslims in New Zealand, but essentially a lot of Muslims who are growing up in the West, we want to move to this, I guess, more positive, more accepting, more, we can be who we want to be as Muslims. I guess there are some people who might be thinking, that's just wishful thinking, but that's my dream as well. And as somebody who's just turned 23, I go to university, it's something that I've seen. And I'm sure many university students here can actually attest to that last semester, I think it started, the amount of habayas that were flying in the summer of last year was insane. You don't understand. And that just lit something in me, that made me so happy to see that they're proud, and they're happy, and there's this environment that we're heading towards, that they're comfortable enough to do that. It's not to say that we don't still have issues, we don't still have problems, but I think it's a step in the right direction. We're heading somewhere. And I think, reading a book as well, I felt so many different emotions. If you guys haven't, I don't really something I want to say to you. But I was telling this to my friends. I was like, in the first 20 minutes of your book, like I felt like personally attacked, and I'll tell you why. Because I really did look up to PewDiePie. So anybody who knows, PewDiePie is like chapter 1 of the book, and I was just, my 12-year-old self was like, absolutely not. I'm not doing this. And I closed the book. I was like, I'm not continuing this. And for 45 minutes, I was thinking, I'm like, but why am I offended though? Like, I don't like that I'm offended. Let me just continue reading. And I think the reality is that he played a big part in my childhood, I think. But also that, you know, you were looking at the big picture and what that meant, you know, to us Muslims in the long run, and what that meant to other concepts out there. So, yeah, and I felt so many different emotions while reading the book. Sometimes I laughed. There was a chapter that talked about weddings, and I thought that just hit the nail on the head. And then overall, I just really resonated with the book because, you know, essentially, I would say like I felt understood. So if you're Muslim and you're in the West, I don't know why you haven't read this book already. You should be reading it. And yeah, so those are just my personal comments on it. I think Jazakallah khair. I think it's a masterpiece, and I did a fabulous job on that, but that's just from me.
Jazakallah khairan. Thank you so much. Again, thank you for this fantastic conversation. I'm sorry if I offended your 12-year-old self.
That's okay.
I am a little bit older, so I don't have the same relationship with someone like PewDiePie. But it's really good to hear that you resonated with it. And honestly, thank you, NZMA for hosting this event, and thank you, Nia, for volunteering and being a part of it, and hopefully feeding us afterwards.
100%. We're an ethnic event, don't worry. We won't be getting into stuff. Khair, inshallah. Jazakallah khair. I guess this concludes the talking part of the event. Thank you so much for joining us. And inshallah, I'm pretty sure it's time to eat, but I'll hand it over to Sister Niloufar. So, sorry, before we go, we do want to open up the floor to Q&A. So if there's anyone who has questions, please shoot them through.
Yes. Assalamu alaikum. Thank you, Sister, for the introduction you did. Just one highlight before I ask Brother Muhammad a question. Because Brother Muhammad is in the media, so he knows we have to watch our language. So between Palestine and Israel, it is not a conflict. Number one. Right? Yeah, I know, you didn't mean, but just to highlight. Sorry. Number two, they are not both sides. Never. Okay? Thank you. Okay, back to you, Muhammad. Sorry for this. Two things. It's not question that just to clarify. Being a Muslim, so in New Zealand or any other Western countries, you might face some challenges, like you are in the mall and it's time to pay. There's no time, there is no place to pay, there's no place to make wudu. So is there any workaround on this for our students and schools and uni? Number one. Number two, I just came back from Christchurch and I met a lot of Muslims there. It looks like 30% plus or minus of the Muslims in Christchurch, they decide not to go to masjid anymore after the Christchurch attack. So we need to send a clear, strong, good message to them. Thank you.
Well, Jazakallah, thank you very much for that. And yes, you're absolutely right. The Israel-Palestine conflict is not a conflict. It's an apartheid system, and we need to talk about it as such. And I am always inspired when I see media representation that is accurate, and a lot of it isn't accurate. But I think it is changing, and I hope that it is changing for the better. We're also seeing a lot more Palestinians leading their conversation from the ground. We saw that happen last year in May. We saw a lot of incredibly articulate Palestinians, young Palestinians, from Palestine talking about their own struggle and their own plight. And I think that is really the only way to be able to convey what actually is happening over there. And I think with regards to the question about like praying spaces in malls and things like that, I think that's a really good one. I wouldn't know how to kind of specifically navigate that, but I think it's definitely important because I'm really happy to see going to Auckland Airport, having a prayer space there, and a really beautiful one too. That's something that is very heartening. I currently live in London for work, and in London, basically all like the big malls that they have over there, there's a prayer space at the bottom, and there are there's so many Muslims that live living in London, living in those areas, that they are over time, over generations, have learned how to engage with their community, with sewer, or with these places, and these are essentially we're talking about malls, we're talking about commercial spaces, and these commercial spaces definitely have an interest in trying to kind of cater towards their consumers, and so specifically, there are this particular malls, I don't know which ones those would be that are kind of frequented by more Muslims than anybody else. I don't know whether that's like Lynn Mall or St. Luke's. Those are the ones. Cool. Good, I've still got my finger on the that maybe a good strategy would be to approach their administrations and kind of talk about hey, is there a way of providing this kind of space? Is there anything that we can do in the community to make it easier? And I'm sure that all of these spaces will be receptive. It just kind of takes the willpower and the energy to be able to do it. And with regards to the community in Christchurch, and generally speaking, I think it's not just in Christchurch, this feeling, but and a lot of our communities across the country, people are feeling nervous and unsafe in these spaces, and I don't blame them at all. There's very real reasons that people feel like this place that is supposed to be a sanctuary for us, that is supposed to be the source of safety, was shattered on March 15. And this isn't just in New Zealand as well. I've spoken to so many people in Australia, in the UK, even as far as the UK, and in the US, that feel the same thing, that feel that they're not immune and that they're not safe. And I think also this is a question for us as a Muslim community. There's an aspect of what we can engage with authorities about trying to keep our community safe, but there's also a question for us in the community. How do we address this? How do we make sure that we're making everybody in our community feel safe, feel welcomed? How do we address these concerns, but also how do we give spaces for people to talk about these things? I think it could be difficult for a lot of people to publicly come out and say that they're afraid of going to the mosque or that they don't go to the mosque anymore. But that, I think, is a missed opportunity for us to create spaces where everybody feels like they can step forward and have their issues and concerns addressed. Thank you.
Assalamualaikum. Assalamualaikum, Brother Hassan. Maghrib time is very close, so I wouldn't take much time on that. And people are hungry too, I think. It's dinner time. I've been in this country last 30 years now. I brought up my 3 daughters here. And there are some issues which every single schoolgirls, they face that, not only Muslims. I find many things, really, that this is in our mind only. You call it an inferiority complex or any kind of complex. Of course, there are discrimination, and discrimination is not only in music, in our countries, South and West, East and East, Sunni and Shia, that kind of thing. So most of the things we actually drew some time in our mind. My question is, mashallah, I know your father a long time. I just met today after a long time. And I was so happy that he's your father. I must have seen you as a boy. I'm not sure that you remember. So my question is that he belongs to Egypt. And in Egypt, you know what's happening over there. There's a lot of discrimination going on against Muslims. And people are making stories, the media making stories about like Coptic Christians and that kind of things. Have you been to Egypt? My question is about Egypt. What did you feel over there as compared to New Zealand?
Yeah, I mean, I have had an opportunity to visit Egypt plenty of times, alhamdulillah, since we migrated here in the 90s. And Egypt is still a very dear part of who I am. It's still a home to me. And it is, you know, we talked about the Arab Spring before, one of the reasons that I became a journalist. And it's definitely been quite difficult to be able to see how things unfolded there, not just in Egypt, but in a lot of countries. And I mean, inshallah, I think this is just a phase and a test for us, and that we were going to come out of it. And there's a lot of challenges, as you mentioned, all across the Muslim world, all across a lot of countries where we come from. And it's always tricky because both of these things are very much alive in your own imagination as somebody who is a New Zealander, who grows up here and spends most of their life here. You can't disconnect yourself from what's happening back home. And there is a sense of duty to not lose that connection to it. And there are a lot of questions about, you know, what people can do in a lot of these places. You know, we talked about Palestine, we talked about Egypt and other places as well, where we are very much trying to continue to be engaged with these places. And there is only so much that we actually can do that is within our power here to be able to change these things. But I think what is in our power and what we have control over is how this country treats us, how we treat ourselves in this country, how we navigate through the world with the kind of confidence that you mentioned, that often at times is shaken. A lot of times we do navigate through the world with a shaken sense of self-confidence in who we are. We don't feel confident in the fact that we're Muslim. We don't feel confident in the fact that we are immigrants or children of immigrants. And that is something that we can control. The way that we react, the way that we see ourselves, the way that we demand our rights as citizens as equal to everybody else, that is something that we can control. And we also have a lot of racism issues within our community, between us, and that also is a massive challenge that we do need to address and we need to acknowledge. This is something that is a lot more difficult to be able to challenge, but it's necessary. I think there are a lot of natural fragments within our wider Muslim community here in New Zealand, and there's a lot. I mean, I don't think there are good reasons, but I think we really, I do want us to be able to see a community that is alive, that feels really connected, so that people like us and people like, you know, when March 15 happened, it was the first time for a lot of us to really engage with the community down in Christchurch. And that was such a shame, such a missed opportunity, that there were all of these Muslims, and how many of us are there in the country? It's like 40, 50,000. And we need to be able to communicate with each other better. We need to be able to address the issues that we have within our community, especially the difficult ones, and that to really imagine what this community could look like going forward for the next few generations. Does that go?
Hi, I just have a question. So, how do you think young Muslims that grew up in like a Western society and like area can deal with like feeling like an outsider? For example, like me personally, when I was growing up, I came here when I was 7, but just throughout like intermediate and primary, I was always around, you know, like Western people, no Muslims, nothing. And so I adjusted my life to what they were doing, their norms. And then coming into like uni and then meeting Muslims, so in high school and stuff, I always felt like an outsider, you know, because I had no Muslims around me. And then coming to uni, I met Muslims, and then even with them, I felt like an outsider because I was so used to the Western norms. So how, and I know you know, you grew up in a Western society as well. So how did you deal with that personally? How did you, you know, not feel like an outsider?
It's a great question, and it's a tough question because I think that experience of feeling like an outsider is quite a universal experience. It's not just Muslims that feel this way. A lot of people do feel this way for a myriad number of reasons. And a lot of people that come from immigrant communities feel this way. And sometimes it's like a lifelong challenge to try and kind of find a space for yourself that feels like it uplifts who you are. And for me, you know, the Muslim community always, when I was growing up, it felt safe. And then stepping outside of that community always felt like an alienating experience. Certainly when I was at school, I felt like that. And even when I graduated and went into the workplace, when I started working in media, I definitely felt like an outsider. And it's something that, you know, I think there's two aspects of it that I would say. One, and this was true for me, is that when I started finding spaces that felt supportive for me, that really helped quell that sense of, you know, alienation. For me, that was when I found poetry spaces, places that really encouraged me to be able to express myself and to be proud and outspoken about who I was. That really empowered me. For other people, it's sports. A lot of people engage in sports and it makes them feel a sense of pride and a sense of community and a sense of connection. I think one aspect of it is trying to find that space that feels right for you, that feels like it helps you connect. And that's a journey on its own. It's not always very straightforward or obvious what that is. But once you find that space, once you're able to find your tribe, it really helps. And I think, you know, for us, it's important to talk about these things as Muslims, to talk about ways in which we can make those spaces available in our Muslim community so that young Muslims can feel a sense of camaraderie and sense of community. And another aspect of it is just about trying to be confident and proud of who you are. And that also is a journey. And it's a journey that I'm still on. And it is something that, again, I think is really rooted in trying to find out what you're passionate about, what you are good at, what makes you feel alive when you do. And that could be the things that you study, it could be the things that you practice as hobbies, it could be your role in the society or community, whatever that is. Once you find that, it really fuels your sense of self and your sense of understanding about who you are and what your purpose is. And once you feel like you have a sense of purpose in a community, that stops, or it changes this idea of you feeling like an outsider because you feel like you're here for a reason, you're here to do something specific. And that could come, again, from any kind of area that you find yourself in. But I would just say to keep searching, keep trying to find those spaces that are supportive for you, that uplift you, and surround yourself by people that are going to do the same, and that will help you feel a lot more confidence in who you are, a lot more grounded. Thank you.
Sorry, we have to close because it's close to Maghrib and food is out as well, so I'm sorry, my apologies. Thank you so much, Brother Mohamed Hassan and Sister Zena. I really appreciate your time, both of you and all of you as well. Thank you so much for coming here today. And also thank you to the brother who pointed out that it's not a conflict with the Israel-Palestine issue. I completely agree. I think it's sometimes you just hear it so often you don't realize, you know, but that doesn't make it right, so I appreciate that. And once again, thank you so much for your time. And it was a wonderful conversation to be a part of, to listen to. And yeah, that's it. And also, of course, most of all, we'd like to thank Allah, Alhamdulillah, for giving us this opportunity to do this today. I don't want to hold you any further. The food is here, so we can proceed and have some food and then stay over for Maghrib as well. Yes, for the men it's at the back, the food right at the back, and for the ladies, you can there's food in the side, so you can take it from there.